This is 50 Feminist States, a road-tripping storytelling podcast visiting all 50 U.S. states to interview feminist activists and artists about their work for gender justice. I'm Amelia Hruby, and this week, we're in Georgia.
From the glaciers of Alaska to the dunes of Indiana, I want 50 feminist states. From the waves of New Hampshire to skies of Montana, I want 50 feminist states. And when you hear the call, you know so well. Sisters, speak out, I know I will.
Hi everyone, Amelia here. Welcome back to 50 Feminist States Season 3. Today we have our second episode from Georgia. I spoke to Dr. Alix Olson, who was a spoken word touring poet for a very long time and is now a professor at Emory University, Oxford College. We weren't able to connect while I was in Georgia over the summer, but we did have a really wonderful conversation over the phone later in the fall, and I am very excited to share it with you today. You will notice the quality is a little bit different from some of my in-person interviews, but she just shares so much knowledge about spoken word poetry, really profound reflections on the ways that the work that spoken word poetry does has changed as technology has changed, but how it still functions as a tool for social justice in our contemporary world, like it did in the 90s when she was touring and performing queer and feminist poetry across the country. We also talk about her journey from being an artist activist to being an academic, getting her PhD and now teaching at a university. And then I nerd out a little bit and ask a bunch of questions about her research on resilience and some of her feminist icons and inspirations. So all of that is yet to come in today's episode. Before we get there, just one more reminder that if you rate and review the podcast on iTunes before season 3 ends, which is a week from today, you will automatically be entered to win our giveaway for 50 Feminist States prize pack. So you can even do that while you're listening today. Just go ahead and rate and review us in Apple Podcasts. You will automatically be entered. For now, without further ado, here is Dr. Alix Olson.
So my name is Alix Olson, and I am an artist activist who created spoken word performances for a really long time. That was sort of at the core of my identity for a long time. And I now am a professor, an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Emory University at the Oxford campus.
So I would love to just kind of hear if you can share the story of how you started performing spoken word.
So when I was in college, I was taking a lot of poetry classes, and I was really fortunate to have a class with the poet Kate Rushin, who wrote the bridge poem in this bridge called My Back, sort of a renowned Black feminist anthology. And she looked at my poetry one day and just said, "You're writing spoken word." And I had never really heard of spoken word. I certainly had never heard of slam poetry as a phenomenon. This was, I guess, in 1995. And it was kind of just getting off the ground, slam poetry. And so she said, I think you'd be interested in this world. And so when I graduated from college, I moved to New York City I had no plan at all. I was one of the only people I knew who did not have a plan. I sort of had this vague idea about changing the world, doing art. I had just spent 4 years, getting really impassioned and angry about a lot of stuff. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do about that. I started working at a gay bookstore in New York, and just because it seemed like an extension of knowledge. And then one night, I think early on in my time there, went to the New York Poets Cafe. And that night just was a complete explosion. Artistically, politically, creatively, I'd never experienced anything like what was happening in the cafe that night. It was packed with people cheering each other on and all because of poetry. And this is just not my understanding of poetry at all. But in that moment, I understood why Kate had told me to go. And I got up and I read my poem. I had folded in a little star shape in my pocket, and I sort of entered this community. And really early on, I made it onto the Nuyorican slam poetry team, and there were 4 of us on the team. We traveled to the national competition in Austin, Texas that year we won the national competition, and then we started touring as a team. And it was just this really special, indescribably unique time in my life where we just bopped around the country as a little corps, spouting poetry at whoever would have us. And then ultimately I began doing it on my own, primarily because feminist groups on college campuses and lesbian groups on campuses would ask me to come. So I created my own little kind of touring life out of that. Eventually I had a band that I traveled with and a tour manager, and did a lot of festivals and marches and clubs, and we traveled all over the world doing it. And I got to, be a part of so many feminist communities. So when you talk about this sort of 50 feminist states, I feel like that in part was my project also, was just driven by my curiosity about what was happening. And poetry was my vehicle to get to do that, to get to inquire, because I really ended up asking a lot of questions when I was touring.
That's so interesting. As I'm doing this podcast, I love projects that really do kind of seek out feminist community across the nation or the world at large. I like how you describe it. It sounds like an invaluable, hard to, articulate in a single story or instance experience.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could share one or two stories of like a place you were or a poem you read during that touring time, like something that stands out or a moment you've thought of recently, maybe for a reason you don't even, that just like came to mind or something like that.
I was thinking recently about the first Women's March, which, was in the early 2000s. And I remember performing a poem I had called Cunt Country, and standing on stage. It was the largest march in U.S. history. I think there were like 1 million people there. And it was profound that the largest march in U.S. history was a feminist march, And I remember doing Cunt Country in front of the White House and just feeling like there's like, this is it. Like, this is the point of feminist activism. And then going back after Trump's election and it feeling like we're starting the whole thing over again, It's like, but also just the way that language changes, as a person who worked primarily within the field of language and now studies discourse, as a scholar of Foucault and a queer theorist, thinking of the ways in which language changes as a tool of resistance has been really fascinating to track, and I think that my understanding of that has changed over time with my new understanding, and new sort of insights. As a thinker. It seemed like at the time, I remember feeling when I was touring, like this language is so radical. The language that we're using, that we're wielding words as weapons, I think was like my slogan. It just felt so radical. And now so much of it feels so dated, and sort of acclimating to the ways in which change itself is something to embrace, right, rather than resist. And talking to students now, I talk to students who are queer identified who would laugh at the idea of screaming "cunt country," and that was like the pinnacle of my career. So there's also like a lot of humility, I think, in rolling with the ways that discourse shapeshifts.
Yeah. It's such a profound reflection, and I'm sure like has to be such a personal moment of reckoning and kind of feeling like what you just said, like the pinnacle of your career is something that some of your students hard, and definitely something I also feel with my students.
Yeah. Right. I called myself a dyke recently, and I had one student say, like, you can't use that word. You can't use the word dyke. Oh. That's not like an okay word to use.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, oh my God, I globe-trotted for a decade to reclaim this word. Don't tell me I can't use this word, right?
Yeah. It seems like kind of watching videos of your tour, and I watched at least the trailer of the documentary that was made about it.
Uh-huh.
Could you maybe speak to, it seems like really spoken word and performance was this sort of like form of social justice work that you were doing. And I'm wondering, did you think of it that way? Do you think spoken word was or still is a mode of social justice? And how can that work? What does that look like?
Yeah, certainly it has the technologies that are available I mean, both literally and the Foucaultian sense of technologies, right? The ways that that we transport these ideas to one another have changed. So at the time, there was a real material. It felt like a real material grassroots network that we were engaged in building as spoken word artists. So that part of it was about the substance of what we were saying, but a lot of it was about the actual work of doing. It was about the traveling. It was about the literal infrastructure that it felt like we were building as cultural workers. So that we would go from one town and be, performing at either individually or collectively performing at a rally, and then go to the next town and tell them about the rally where we had just been, right? And so we felt like grassroots media, and I think we were in some ways. And so when people would say you're preaching to the converted, that was like the main critique, was like, well, but you're talking to people who already believe these ideas. It was like, yeah, but that's my role. I don't see my role as like converting people ideologically. Like, I feel like part of my work is letting people know they're not alone. Mm-hmm. And that impetus has changed. I think that people don't experience that aloneness in that same way anymore, just because of the material shift of the internet and social media. So what role do spoken word artists play that are actually traveling and touring now? I'm not sure. Certainly not that same specific sense of community building, although I will say that people coming out in their real bodies, in their real material bodies, to gather in a space and witness somebody on a bare stage just using their body and their voice to say something is increasingly, I think, a unique moment. And so performers who can get people out of their homes and out from their TVs and their computers, I think are still performing that kind of work, because people still need to gather,
Yeah.
So did I see myself as doing social justice work? Yeah, I did. That was the main thing I thought I was doing.
Yeah.
And it was not just like trying to get people to think what I thought. It was, I think, in many ways trying to embody or perform irreverence and risk-taking at times, during many times when I was afraid to do that. I remember after 9/11, this conversation that a lot of us had about what we should do. Like, is it too dangerous to travel? Is it too dangerous to spout this kind of anti-nationalist, anti-imperialist rhetoric at this moment? Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of conversation around, like, no, we have to do it anyway. That's the point. Like, the point is to keep doing this work. And I remember traveling internationally after that time, and people saying, like, it's really important for us to hear people from the United States saying these kinds of things about the United States in this moment.
Yeah. I think it's just so fascinating to reflect on kind of that history and how things change, but also how we circle back to different but similar moments. When I was watching the trailer for the documentary, there was this moment of like, I had, because there's a scene where I think you and someone you were traveling with are like in front of the White House kind of mocking it. And in my mind, I'm immediately like, oh yes, of course, like mocking Trump's White House. And I'm like, wait, no, this isn't now. This was
that was Bush.
Yeah, Bush. And so I think that I had to like catch myself in the wording, my tendency to think of the present as all of time or something.
Yeah.
So as a reminder of like, there are many moments where these technologies like crop up and the work they're doing is interesting and different and important. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I was just thinking about that when I watched it, and then hearing you kind of talk about the different role that played then and may play now. And I think the internet has changed that, which is something I reflect on a lot in traveling, but also recognize that like sometimes I'll go to two cities an hour away from each other and talk to two people doing work around the same things who have never heard of each other.
Right.
The internet does something strange to distance, I think, and to time that grassroots activists are still figuring out how to work with.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I feel like I'm thinking about, Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about preservation through transformation and the ways in which things, she's talking about in the context of the carceral state and how, slavery became Jim Crow, becomes mass incarceration, and how just because things take a different form or look different doesn't mean that they're different. And I think that that's really true in a lot of the things that I was critiquing, which, unfortunately are still relevant. So the language has changed. And so some of the, my poems I think are really outdated in terms of like how they're saying things, but the problem is consistent, and it's incredibly disconcerting. So are spoken word artists still necessary for social justice work? Like, yeah, they are. And I love that a lot of my students write spoken word, and they're doing that for their final project. And I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah. I teach a class called the Arts of U.S. Activism, and it's a class that traces activist sites through creative and artistic interventions, and their final project is to create an artistic intervention. And so they're doing these amazing projects where they're taking over the campus with paintings of non-binary gender portraits, or they're staging sort of Me Too protest marches in the quad. And but what's incredible is like it's the same stuff I would have taken issue with when I was 19,
Yeah, it sounds like such an exciting class.
Yeah, it is. And it's also what's really exciting about it is that because I am an artist, and because that's my background, I have so many people that I can bring in to talk to these students. It's not just like, let's read about these people. And in fact, there's one person who she studies graffiti culture.
Cool.
And her book is called Graffiti Girls. Her name is Jessica Pabon-Colon. And she wrote this book about performing feminism in the hip hop diaspora. And her work is all about hip hop as a site of feminist art activism. And I emailed her and I just said, hey, can you come talk to my class? And she said absolutely. And then she said, oh, I'm familiar with your work from back in the day. Will you come talk to my class? So all of these art activists from back in the day who are now in these positions of being professors are doing these exchanges. And it's like a different, it's just a different kind of work, but it feels like that those resources are not being lost. They're just being transformed.
That's fascinating. And could you talk a little bit about kind of your journey and how you ended up at Emory?
Yeah. So the last project that I did as a sort of active artist, I decided to put together an anthology. It's called Word Warriors. And it was an anthology of the women who were touring, I think, as full-time spoken word artist activists. And as I was finishing that anthology, I don't know, something felt like it was coming to a close for me and for my own work. And in part, it felt like I wanted to delve back into theory. And there just hadn't been time to do that when I was touring all the time. And, a lot of the labor that's involved in being an artist activist is dreary labor. It's like there's a lot of, at that time, like in the very beginning, it was calling people on the phone and trying to find a place to stay. And I just was kind of tired. I was tired by my own work. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to delve back into theory. That was my love, and it's where what I had done when I was an undergraduate. And I knew that theory had changed and that the world was changing. And I was sort of, as much as I was a part of it while I was on the road, I was also missing a lot of what was happening in scholarship. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to give myself time and space to do that. And so I did that it took me 8 years to do my PhD because I also had 2 kids in that time. Mm-hmm. I now have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. And I will say that those 2 projects are pretty astounding as well, mm-hmm. And complex and challenging feminist projects. Mm-hmm. And then right as I was finishing my PhD, I got this job. So it was certainly not easy, and a lot of things happened for me, I think personally, that were challenging. But this is, I don't know, this feels like a great synthesis of the work that I was doing, because this place where I am, in particular, Oxford, values teaching above all else, which was my love. I mean, I like writing. I love reading, but the teaching aspect is why I wanted to do this work. And I love Atlanta. I feel like it's a racially diverse, culturally diverse, artistically available place to be. So I feel really fortunate that I landed here.
That's Wonderful. I would also love to hear more. I love the title of your, I think, dissertation and book you're working on, The Promises of Resilience, Governance, and Resistance in Complex Times. And I kind of just want to be a nerd and ask if you could just talk a little bit about your concept of resilience and what that means, either from like a really academic perspective or maybe how you see it like in relation to like activist work today.
Yeah. So I started thinking about resilience when I was in New Orleans, and I saw a sign that said, "Stop calling me resilient." And I was kind of stumped, and I love that kind of being stumped. And so I started just really grappling with this idea that resilience has been, what seemed to be on the rise, as something that was a positive thing. And so I wanted to know what was going on. And so my book, hopefully my book, it starts with the individual subject and the ways in which I think as individual people, our subjectivities are being shaped through resilience discourses. And I look at the self-help industry as a technology that's doing that work. And then I think about communities. And in that context, I look at New Orleans and the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient campaigns, and the ways in which cities are now being shaped as resilient cities, and the kinds of banking programs and loan and funding programs that are being used to make more resilient economies in these cities, and more resilient architecture. And then I look at the U.S. military as a site of resilience building, and I argue there that the military is being shaped as a resilient force of what they actually call super soldiers. It's the largest psychological experiment in U.S. history, being conducted on 1.1 million soldiers who are being subjected to resilience training. And I'm arguing that essentially in the context of austerity policies and the draining of funding for soldiers and for veteran programs, that what they're doing there is this is what positive psychologists are actually doing in the program, is taking away this concept of PTSD and replacing it with pre-resilience soldiering. So the idea is that soldiers will be capable of enduring longer and longer deployments, and shouldn't suffer from trauma, because if they do their training properly, they will be resilient enough to withstand endless war and suffering. And then I look at the World Bank and specifically policies about building resilient refugees and immigrants, the ways in which empowerment policies are being replaced by resilience policies, because the idea is that pain and suffering is not going to end at any time soon. And so it doesn't really help to be empowered anymore because there are no opportunities to claim. Rather, we need to be resilient in the context of all of the hardships that are bound to come our way. And then finally, I look at the building of a resilient human species, and I look at the NASA's plans to go to Mars. And the discourse there is literally about making the human species more resilient by expanding us to become an interplanetary species, because the world, plus the United States, is being destroyed by capitalism. So I'm arguing there that taking capitalism to another planet is not really the solution. So it's ultimately a critique of the ways in which resilience is being used in the service of neoliberalism. But I'm not arguing that we need to get rid of the concept altogether, but rather we need to be more critical of the ways in which it's used and who's using it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I want to read this book, so I hope it comes out to the world sometime soon.
Thanks. Yeah. It's really complicated because resilience is also something that artists and activists, and Black Lives Matter uses it. It was used at the Standing Rock protest. So it's definitely, I think, a site of contest and a tug of war over how it's being used.
Yeah, I've heard so many appeals to resilience from so many places, but it does sound like all of the instances that you're describing and critiquing are ways in which systemic and structural issues are being passed off onto individuals or communities to
withstand.
Yeah.
What's not being changed.
Yeah. I always like to end interviews by asking about maybe other feminists or activists that you admire, past, present, or future.
Certainly as an undergraduate at Wesleyan University, Judith Butler was somebody who profoundly shaped my thinking around gender. And while it doesn't seem so mind-blowing to my students anymore, it certainly was a kind of critical intervention in my own way of thinking about the production of subjectivities that forever changed how I understood myself, my own identity. And then, of course, people like Ani DeFranco, who I think paved the way for so many grassroots feminist artists to build indie careers. And I certainly shaped a lot of my touring life around what she and others like her were doing in the late 1990s. You know, and there's like a litany of feminist thinkers I could point to, like Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich and Bell Hooks. And then there are people that just like were at my core, like the Indigo Girls, you know, I think people who just like spoke to my soul on some profound level.
Yeah, definitely. I think everybody hopefully has, but definitely needs those sorts of people inside them.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that we didn't talk about in terms of your work or feminism in the Atlanta area that you wanted to kind of discuss?
Just that there are, I've brought a number of really incredible activists to campus who I didn't know about before I moved to the South. I mean, moving to the South, I moved here last July, so I've had just about over a year to sort of figure out what's happening here at some level. Southerners Organizing on New Ground is a really incredible racial economic justice project led by feminists of color here in Atlanta, and they're just doing incredible work. The acronym is SONG. There's also an organization called Black Mamas Matter that's doing really incredible work in terms of here in Atlanta. I'm writing an article right now on Black Lives Matter organizations or chapters in the South and the ways that those look different from other chapters. And so I think about just sort of the attention that I've been able to bring for myself in terms of what these national, you know, they kind of, everything gets lumped together, right? It's like Black Lives Matter is doing this, and we can read their national platform or agenda. But to actually examine what's happening on the ground where you live, I think is really critical. And something that, as someone who was touring around, I was never in one place long enough to actually get involved locally in what was happening. So I always felt like I had this broad overview of what was going on, but never able to drill in really deeply. And so as a feminist thinker and as an academic, I feel like part of my work is using the resources that I now have to draw attention to what's happening locally in the place where I'm working. And so that's part of what I'm doing, is bringing those folks to the campus so that students can then organize with them, connect with them outside once they graduate, to give them sort of activist opportunities that they might not have otherwise.
Yeah, both those organizations sound amazing, and I will link to them. Wonderful. I think those are all the questions I had for us to talk through. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thanks so much to Alix for taking time to speak with me, and to you for tuning in. I have linked in the show notes the organizations that Alix mentioned there at the end, as well as some recordings of her poetry, the trailer to the documentary that she was in, and a link to the anthology that she edited. So lots of good stuff in the show notes. You can find those at 50feministstates.com/podcast or in most podcast listening apps as well. Next week is the final week of season 3, which honestly is hard to believe. Next week, we will also visit our 25th state, which means that we are halfway done with 50 Feminist States, which I can barely believe. It's been such a whirlwind and such a joyous journey, and I am so happy and honored to have featured so many voices and shared so many stories. So I'll save more of my sappy reflections for our actual 25th episode, but be sure you stay tuned as we wrap up season 3 with episode 25 next week in Kentucky. Until then, I'll see you on the road.
50 estados feministas. 50 estados feministas. 50 feminist states.
for tuning in to this episode of 50 Feminist Dates. You can find show notes at 50feministdates.com/podcast and follow us on Instagram at 50 Feminist States. Special thanks to Danielle Sines and Jessica Neria for our theme song. Until next time, wild ones, we'll see you on the road.